So we are very pleased to welcome Emily Erikson to our seminar series. She is a professor of sociology and a professor of management by courtesy at Yale University. Her work spans the boundaries of sociology, economic history, and sociological theory. Her first book, Between Monopoly and Free Trade, the English East India Company, 1600 to 1757, analyzed the emergence of early multinational firms and the structure of early modern global trade. It also may be of interest to the audience here that it is the first book in the Princeton Analytical Sociology series. Her second book, Trade and Nation, How Companies and Politics Reshaped Economic Thought, argues that political discourse and the adoption of the company form actively encouraged the development of classical economic thought in the early modern era. And I have just a hunch that we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that argument today. A reminder to you all that this talk is being recorded and will be posted later on our YouTube channel. The Q&A afterwards will not be recorded. Emily is very willing, even prefers to take questions during the talk. But please remember that our editing team is not the most sophisticated one in the world. So if you do ask a question during the talk, you risk becoming part of the public record. Without any further preliminaries, I will hand things over to presenter. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's a great pleasure to come. I've always wanted to come and see this group, and it's very inspiring. And I hope that by visiting also that we can maintain connections and sort of build more between, the different universities and sort of, informal social networks that are very interested in keeping the analytical sociology tradition vibrant and flourishing as I believe it is now. I do like questions. I do notice that there's a comment in the chat currently right now.
I wrote it.
Okay, okay, okay.
Informal.
So I can't see that, so please interrupt me if it comes around. Okay, that's great. So I just want to give a little bit of a preamble about this project and how I think about both comparative historical sociology and analytical sociology, which I think are extremely complementary and have some similar goals, especially the way that I practice both of them. So I've been thinking more about sociology and the social sciences and what the sort of central contribution is to knowledge and the world more generally. And I think that one of the things that sociology in particular does really well is to think about unintended consequences. And unintended consequences, I see certainly in terms of historical processes, are often more important than the direct outcomes of the intentional actors. And I think that it's really crucial for us to know what unintended consequences are going to be created by things like policy interventions if we actually want to improve the world through those policy interventions. And it seems to me that both sociology, comparative historical, and in particular analytical sociology, which is doing this exact work of linking the intentions that actors have to the very sometimes diverse sets of outcomes that can follow from those intentions. That's really extremely important to kind of mapping out the terrain of both the intended consequences and the unintended consequences that come from our actions, and that are going to be essential to solving the important kind of coordination problems that we as a society currently face. So that's kind of the larger way. And I mean, I would say in the historical setting, you get to see again and again how sort of different micro level contexts translate into extremely significant large scale historical consequences. So we get to see stuff at the very macro level. And that's sort of what I was trying to do here, and you'll see that the kind of the arc of the story is sort of a translation of specifically kind of a selfish sort of behavior that unintentionally translates into the accumulation of knowledge and a kind of a new framework and abstraction of knowledge that I believe, being a supporter the discipline of economics. I know that's rare within sociology in some cases, but that contributes to our understanding of the world more generally. So that's kind of the larger arc. So the story in particular is not advancing, unfortunately. Okay. So the story in particular is about a shift in economic thought, that took place, and I'll hopefully give you some evidence to establish this, that took place in the 17th century from a sort of a quasi-moral religious framework of understanding economic behavior. For the most part, either behavior that economic behavior was understood as confined within the household, like increasing the wealth of the household, so sort of the Aristotelian tradition, or otherwise it was scholastic scholars, the scholastic tradition that were operating within the framework of Christian theology, and were thinking specifically about issues such as just price, the kind of the preservation of good intentions, and the sanctity of economic transactions under the perspective of the impact on the individual soul, right? So here we're thinking about things like usury as being a sin against humanity. And this was, these were the kinds of things that were debated: just price, the evils of usury. Money was generally some sort of evil thing, a necessary evil. But this largely changes over the course of the 17th century. At this point, you get William Petty introduces the use of the average, which is a big step forward in terms of statistical knowledge at that time. And you have people that are thinking they're incorporating empirical evidence from trade books. They're thinking about flow, specie flow. They're thinking systematically, but especially by the end of this period, systematically about things that resemble laws of economic behavior. And the framework shifts from being about the benefit just to individuals in terms of the preservation of the possibility of going to heaven in the afterlife while engaging in commercial exchange. And it shifts to being about more like the development of resources and what ultimately becomes the idea of the growth of the wealth of the nation. So we see now it becomes empirical, scientific logic is incorporated into the methods, and the unit of analysis pretty much changes, at least in many cases, from the individual to the nation. And we get an idea of economic growth. So in order to look at this significant transition, I think it's important to take a computational historical approach for at least one reason would be that I would say it's important to look at the population of works and the population of authors rather than individuals. Which, and in the history of economic thought, for the most part, the works that have been produced look at individual contributions and the kind of accumulation of individual contributions, individual genius and growth. But this is, I believe, an inadequate approach. And my favorite example of this is the Spanish scholar Antonio Serra. Has anyone ever heard of Antonio Serra? So like a very niche figure, but was made somewhat famous by Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote this, like tome of work, which is, a great work on the history of economic thought. Antonio Serra singled out by Joseph Schumpeter as being the sort of progenitor of the idea of that would come to be comparative advantage. And he was, in many ways a visionary, so potentially very important. But if you notice, this is an image of him writing his famous economic text, now made famous by Joseph Schumpeter. But if you see there's some shackles on his feet, And he wrote this in prison. He was trying to be pardoned. That's why he wrote the text. He wrote it in prison. The jailer put it into a bin. It was then locked in the prison until the middle of the 19th century. And so Joseph Schumpeter found it at that point. But so, it goes into the history of economic thought as being this important transitional moment. In fact, it had no influence or significance at the time. It wasn't a piece of the accumulation of knowledge. It can't be responsible for the changes in the transformation of economic thought. If you're only looking at these one individuals and not the broader population, I think it's very easy to miss these kind of significant limitations that certain works and certain individuals certainly have.
Is it debtor's prison?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't believe that it was.
Not too bad.
I think, yeah, that would be that would be a nice. But I'll check, maybe, and then I can add that into the story. So in order to, really find out what's happening and really find out when it happens also as well, which is of course important to understanding the causes, a corpus is necessary. And there is corpus, and it's an amazing corpus and especially I think people that are interested in NLP these days should take more advantage of this. It's an incredible collection of all of the texts in English, all of the known texts in English or published translations that were published in England. And it's EBO, Early English Books Online, and most of them are represented. They have PDFs, so you can see the text. It looks like this. This is like early modern typeset. This is fairly good. It gets more difficult to read, but my understanding now. So this is it's about 130,000 words. And my understanding now is that I didn't use this method, but that this is one of the things that ChatGPT or the different sort of AI models is actually extremely good at, is cleaning and translating this kind of uneven typeset. So I think now an even more comprehensive kind of search, because of course this is not machine readable format, but on its own. But my understanding now is we have the software makes it actually like incredibly easy to translate this so that the entire corpus is probably available to people. When I was doing this project, ChatGPT, they didn't exist yet, or maybe they were just secret, who knows. But what did exist was a thing called the Text Creation Partnership. The Text Creation Partnership, this was people actually typing these out. They wished, I'm sure they're kind of upset about the transition that's occurred at this point. But they took 60,000 of these texts, so it's a fairly large sample, it's like about a third of the text. And they're all text readable format. It's very, I have access to the data set, so if someone wants it. This is all the text, not only the economic. So the economic texts are a subset, but it's a good resource. It's, however, not a random sample. It's a random sample in the sense that maybe an undergraduate who hadn't been exposed to a precise definition of random sample. So it would use. So it's not systematic, but also not really random. But it's a large proportion of the text with some emphasis on the things that people were more interested in, sort of more famous examples. So this was, so I have 60,000 of these. I did a separate search where I looked at a number of different library collections, European library collections, US library collections, leaning heavily on the Crest collection, which is a collection at Harvard that's focused on gathering all economic texts that have been published in English and important texts in other languages. I'm really focused just on England because, as you can see, England is where this transformation took place. So here's an example of one of the texts from the TCP, the Text Creation Partnership. Texts go from the database is 1450 to 1700. And here I'm mostly interested in about 1580 to 1700. And then there's some republications that go to 1720. So these texts split them into 500 word chunks. They are very varied in terms of their length. So some are very short, 1 page for some, and then some are extremely long, and they do not use things like grammar or paragraph breaks consistently. It's incredibly inconsistent. My favorite example, there's at least on more than one occasion, someone will misspell well, not misspell, they'll spell the same word differently in the title of their book twice.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the extent to which there's a lot of variation. But that can all be cleaned up. And there is, in fact, a specific R package that can be used to clean and adjust for spelling variation in these texts, which was developed for this corpus in particular. So there's lots of tools available. So this is a passage, 500 words, from The Passionate Morris, which was sort of a story of someone traveling through the countryside. Travel was an important part of trade because you had to go somewhere to trade, and knowing sort of the details of where markets were, what kinds of money were exchanged in markets, what are the tax bases that people encountered there. It was crucial to pursuing commerce at this time. So then I do the search of the library catalogs. I got about 6,000 different works that were economic in nature, cross-check that a bunch of different ways. And then I look for the works as they appear in the subset of the larger texts that are in text readable format. That gave me about 2,000, roughly 2,000 texts. They're all split up. And then I use that first to do a little bit of topic analysis, in this case using STM, the structural topic modeling, which uses LDA as its basis, but gives you the ability to look at things over time. So also within this package, they have a procedure that allows you to optimize the number of topics, which I use here, where you're maximizing word exclusivity and coherence. So I didn't choose this number of topics. This was just the kind of optimization of those different measures. It's too bad you can't quite see, unfortunately, because of the way that it cuts off the top of the slide. But the most popular, or the one that occurs most frequently, is Manuel Honor. But you can see these are, here's Seaport, so it's kind of about traveling. Here's Chat Glass Color. That was kind of more in the husbandry, is this, how you do things. So there's a lot about how you create, say, different spirits, or mining. All of these are like the kind of techniques that actually would become the basis of manufacturing over time. But it's a good representation, but I would say still a little bit difficult to work with these 66 different topics in order to see what's going on and how things change over time. So what I then did was use a network of the correlations between topics. So here, the circles are the topics, the sizes weighted by their prevalence across the text. So 21 is this one that I mentioned, Manuel Honor, which is occurs frequently throughout the text. And the arcs are then correlations based on the likelihood that both will occur in the same document. And then if you use just a sort of a basic clustering algorithm on this network this is a walk trap algorithm. The other clustering methods, give similar approximations. You'll maybe get one or two things that fall into a different bin. But you do and get pretty quickly 5 bins, and they correspond to these, what I would call themes that run through the literature. And that substantively make quite a lot of sense. So here, this dark blue is are works that are representative of the theme husbandry, which I would say the husbandry, this Aristotelian focus on techniques that can improve your productivity around the household, Demosthenes, the agricultural, also the land and property owned by single individuals or single households. This does, eventually make a difference. It does become important, certainly for economics. As I said, a lot of it, there's a lot about mining, medicine. Interestingly, also, a lot of that was actually the women's sphere. I mean, this is a total side note, but that was the women's sphere. Also, all the things about medicine and doctoring, that was all women's. But it's kind of moved up because it was associated with the household at that time. Then here, but this is still a little bit marginal because this, of course, this is the age of sail, right? So commerce is kind of the central thing that's occurring and developing and growing over time. People are paying more attention to it in the public sphere. And this is here, the light blue is travel, which is important, as I mentioned, in order to go overseas and find places to trade. You really need to know things like as mundane as what's the depth of the port, for example, or the harbor. Here, what looks green, this dark green, are things that we would associate with more classical topics of economics. Comparative advantage, it starts to get formulated, specie flow across nations, finance, and tax kinds of information.
Question?
Yeah.
So the close relationship in the graph between travel and trade, is that a result of kind of pushing this into a 2D projection, or are those just really connected to each other in a lot of ways?
Oh yeah, these are really connected to each other, because when people are writing the problems that they were for the most part trying to sort out had to do with the expansion of overseas trade. And then overseas trade always has this element of travel of this. So here, this is the kind of stuff, so core of the kind of stuff that it was to become what we think of as economics. This I would say is more like economic implication, like it has economic implications. And here are two possible framings that people relied on over time, and that sort of changes. Also, this is the religious framework. So man will honor, again, 21 right here, man will honor, are you an honorable man when you're engaging in this type of trade? What are the practices that you can engage in order to be an honorable person? But here, the orange is a sort of expanding section, which has a political, or we could say nationalistic sort of overtones. What are the nationalistic overtones of trade? So we can then look at these different topics and their change over time, a couple of different ways. Here, what I did is look at the most popular, the most prevalent topic within clusters. So the man will honor, which I mentioned 4 or 5 times at this point, is here. The yellow line, and this kind of just decreases over the course of the 17th century, where trade England nation, which is the most prevalent of the trade subsections, increases over time. Similarly, the usury, lend, borrow decreases, where company, interest, and nation increases. And we see a big change there. Here, this is a different topic model. Yes.
Quick question regarding the 2 plots. There were like these 2 bumps in the trade topic. Do you know where they come from? Is this just a data inconsistency, or were there like some events?
Oh, do you mean this one?
Yeah, for example, but I think the other one also has like
a little
bumps
here.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, I mean, so here, there's the Glorious Revolution, right? Certainly and then there's a Civil War, so both of these very significant events create some different patterns where, there's kind of some disruptions to publication, but then there's also a lot of controversy. Clearly people are taking different sides, so the impetus to publish increases when things become more controversial. There's also, I mean, this, to be honest, this is really, that's what the end of the second half of the talk is about, the causes of the increase here. So it's not just descriptive. I will get to that. So I won't ruin the punchline though, right? Okay, so this is a keyword modeling strategy, the key ATM, I believe it's called. So from the most representative words from these different topics, then sort of seeded the model with the representative words from these larger clusters in order to look at how they change over time. And so this is T1, you can't really see, but that's just the sort of religious moral framework decreases over time. This is T2, and you can see it goes up a little, and then it dips, and then heads way up. The political increases at a sort of a slower pace. The husbandry, wine, so tree color, malt, mine, this kind of decreases. And then the travel is on a slow increase as well. Yes.
Good question about the corpus. So now I see that England comes a lot. Is it only in, so it's only English speaking books, right? But are there any like translations or anything that is like besides in the English context?
Yes, there are some translations. And there is some significant subset that is Latin works, but that just becomes really noisy. So we took the Latin works out. But there are other translations of a couple of French texts, like I think Baudin is in there somewhere, and some other. It's not a huge amount, but it is there. It is, I mean, this is something that I often don't really, I should probably spend more time talking about it at the beginning of the talk. But so one of the things is clearly there's a lot of French, for example, economic theory that becomes important over time for, say, Adam Smith, but it doesn't happen in the 17th century. So it's not, the physiocrats are an 18th century phenomenon. So there is no comparable surge in economic thought in other nations at this time. This is pretty exceptional. And I'll give you some more evidence of that towards the end of the talk. So focusing on England and English. So then this is a count of not topics, but works, and broken down by the same clusters or themes, I would say. And it just shows very similar trend where you get this really significant increase in trade over time. The husbandry and the religion are sort of just stay at kind of low rates or decline. And in this case, we see a little bit more clearly that politics also seems to become sort of more important as a framing device. So then the question, not just, did the shift occur? So hopefully this establishes that there was an important shift. This important shift also did take place in the 17th century. For example, it did not take place when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which was more than a century later. There's something that was a precursor to that he was drawing upon. And it's exactly this, these mercantilist authors writing things in the 17th century. So why did this happen? Why was this a significant sea change, I would say? So why does it happen? Well, now we have kind of the figures, so we can use this as basis, thinking about the timing of different events or different factors that might. So here this again, this is just becomes kind of like the dependent variable. I'm going to flesh out the mechanism first, but this sort of is the count of the books. The count is the dotted line, and this is the proportion of economic texts out of the entire Igbo corpus. So the proportion also is pretty high here. And again, this is something that's very different from, say, France, very different from what was to become Germany. You know, there was a cameralist tradition, but it wasn't as prolific or as influential for classical economics as these works that are represented in the figure. So when thinking about what are the kind of possible hypotheses about the change, then what are the causes? And I think it's really useful to now step back. We've been doing sort of the macro perspective, right? So now I think it's useful to step back and think about context. So of course, then it's the authors of the works and the context in which they're operating that are going to be crucial to understanding the process through which this transformation occurs. And here, I know this is, tables are a little bit difficult to read, but so here I use the Oxford National Dictionary Biography to break down. Now, not all the authors are known, and a lot of people publish under pseudonyms or just anonymously, but these are the known authors. And usually that they had a biographical entry, probably because having written the work is sort of one of the criteria for being included in the National Dictionary Biography. I broke down yeoman, merchant, professional, clergy, military, and noble and gentry. Noble and gentry are extremely important. So sort of the key takeaway then from this table is you go from relatively low proportion of merchants, except in the first year when there's not enough cases for it to really be informative, to 38%. And you get a kind of the opposite trajectory with the nobles and the gentry. So here's something that's sort of easier to see the trend over time, and we get more and more merchants writing more and more of these texts. So why would the merchants write these texts? Do merchants now write books for publication? Not that often, right? Why would they? They can make more money plying their trade rather than trying to write these books. So here's an example, though. They wrote into the books, into the foreword, usually at least the explicit reason that they were writing these texts. And almost inevitably, they were trying to persuade someone in the government to take a specific position on an issue of policy regarding overseas trade. So this is Charles Davenant. He was affiliated with the English East India Company. He's writing specifically to make an argument to his lordship, someone that was serving in Parliament, about what stand they should take on regulation of overseas trade. The issue that was really most significant at this time was the importation of cotton textiles and the also co-occurrence of the destruction, demolition of the woolen industry in England. And most people found that there was a significant association between these two trends, and then also advocated that, in fact, the import of cotton textiles should be banned in order to preserve the English woolen industry. That, of course, would significantly damage the overseas trade, particularly to the East India, where the textile manufacturing was extremely strong in the Indian subcontinent, especially with cottons. And so someone like Charles Davenant then made the argument that, in fact, this would be hurting the English consumer, because although we might preserve the woolen industry, we would be depriving the English consumer of the opportunity to buy cotton textiles, a more desirable commodity, at a lower price. So this was a very significant step forward for how people thought about economics and the kind of relationship between the population, the prices, and trade flows. And it came out of a specific controversy regarding a specific company and the specifics of foreign policy, essentially, foreign commercial policy. So we might ask, though, then further, why would these merchants feel that it's necessary to write public tracts in order to persuade these people to take certain actions? Why not just lobby them directly? Well, they did lobby them directly, but they also were somewhat removed from the offices of government. So over the course of the 17th century, the number of merchants serving in parliament decreases. They're mostly pushed out by people that were seeking greater political power, because parliament is becoming more politically important in England over the course of this century. And this is a representation of the network of individuals that served on the companies and councils of trade. So all the nodes are individuals. They're connected if they serve on the same council or committee of trade. And then the light blue, I don't know who they are. I couldn't find a record of the people. This was actually so difficult because they're often listed by their title, and the titles are so complicated. It took me a long time to go through it. I mean, and because you'll have like 4 Earl of Nottinghams at one time, but this is, you can distinguish them in different ways. But so, and the colors are a little like, but the dark blue are the merchants, and then most of the purplish are sort of the aristocracy in one form or another. And it's totally covered actually by the little section up here, but there's this little cluster at the very top, which is kind of interesting because there's two merchants that are sort of in a marginal position, and one is Thomas Munn and the other is Gerard de Melaines. And those are actually the 2 of the most significant economic thinkers of the century. But they're not at the center of this network, suffice it to say. And more generally, the merchants, this is just a measure of the embeddedness of the different authors of the text in this council committees network. The merchants are much less well embedded, and they're less central to this policy network than either the class of professional individuals like lawyers that took administrative positions within the government, or with the aristocrats, the gentry, and the lords that were really at the core and the center of this. So the merchants are not only there structurally on the margins here, but they're constantly complaining that the government does not care, that the state doesn't care about their expertise. And the state probably did not actually value their expertise very much. So they're on the margins. They can lobby, but they're taking every opportunity that they can to reach out to convince these individuals to take the positions that really, for the most part, that maybe they believe are beneficial for the nation, but they certainly believe that those measures are beneficial for them as individuals. So this is the motivation, it's material motivation to write these texts. They're reaching sort of across a gulf. At the same time, these chartered companies are becoming a prevalent mode of organizing economic activity in England. And that chartered companies are large-scale corporations that are granted exclusive rights and privileges to different areas of trade. And they're doing 2 things for these merchants. They're sort of amplifying the power of the merchants in a way that's still outside of the sphere of the state itself. So they're amplifying the power and the voice. And they are also causing a lot of controversy within merchant circles, because since they're monopolies, some people are in them and some people are out, and the people that are out don't really like the monopolies being given to the people that are in. So there's sort of a lot of conflict generated that way. And often the chartered companies would actually hire people to write anonymous tracts in favor of different policy positions that would benefit the companies. So they're sort of like motors of this economic thinking. So here then to now sort of provide a little bit of a test of the hypotheses here. I should go, sorry, I'm going back and forth, but I just want to, before I go to the test, well, I can say that this is, here, again, this is the number of economic texts. And you can see that overlaid upon that is the number of companies that are being founded. So there seems, to be a sort of, looks like there's maybe potentially an association there, although we'd have to further test that, of course. So this ends up being about sort of, yes.
Was that the rate of founding or the cumulative total of chartered companies over time?
It's the cumulative total. There's not very much that I can do about that because when they're dissolved.
Yeah.
There's no formal record of the dissolution.
Okay.
They just kind of trail off. Essentially, there's the increase in the companies, and then also this marginal situation that the merchants find themselves in, or what is declining merchant representation in Parliament are kind of my two main hypotheses then about what's going on and why there is this efflorescence of economic thinking. And again, in the theoretical then sort of lens through which I understand this is a cultural whole, sort of Ron Reiger, cultural whole, decoupled institutions, more like a Harrison White kind of way, a language. I mean, both are obviously very closely related, but we have the merchants, the world of merchants, there's controversy, conflict, the merchants are divorced, essentially, not entirely divorced, but they're distant, right? They're distant from Parliament, from the world of the state. And in order to reach the world of state, to persuade these actors, they have to invent this new discourse. They have to, a new discursive strategy that bridges the two spheres. What's in between the two spheres? Well, almost by definition, at least in a sort of a Harrison White theoretical framework, that would be the public sphere. The public sphere is the thing which is bridging across these different institutional contexts. So it's this distance then that creates the need for the communication of a new set of ideas, motivations, that becomes the foundation for something that develops into classical economic thought over time. So the time series analysis that is sort of tests of this theory. Here are a number of different factors that people have proposed were potentially important in increasing economic thought or, economic writings. Right? So there's been lots of individuals that have proposed that it's when people experience economic turmoil, then they have to sort of explain what's going on, and so it drives them to write things. Increasing state capacity, tax revenue fear, that's sort of the Schumpeterian idea of what is, the government needs more ideas about how to control economy. So then they press people into writing about economics. The recharters of the companies I have here, the trades, just the meetings of the trades councils and committees, growth in GDP, growth in commerce, overseas commerce. So all these things then are put into a time series analysis. Time series analysis is detrended, of course, so it's fluctuations. Not the trend over time. And we're looking at changes that occur the year prior to publication. So that it's possible that there's a publication process, which of course, even then, it was a little faster than it is now, but it's not instantaneous. So most of these are not in any way significant, but the two coefficients that do achieve levels of significance are the number of companies founded the year previous and the number of merchants in Parliament. However, the number of companies has a positive impact on the number of economic texts published the following year, and the number of merchants in Parliament has a negative impact. So the more merchants you have in Parliament, the less economic texts are published the following year. And then so my presumption here is that because they have more opportunities to voice their disquiet if there's more merchants in the Parliament. So the opportunities are curtailed and they have to pursue other avenues to achieve their policy goals. And then as another piece of evidence here is the comparative framework. Thinking about, well, what are these, is there a similar institutional? Oh, do you have a question? No, okay. Similar institutional settings. So I would say, I think that the best comparison for Britain at this time, or England, British Isles, is the Dutch Republic. And the Dutch Republic. So here, this is, Dutch Republic, and here's Queen Elizabeth is for England at this time. The Dutch Republic, as I'm sure all of you are familiar, it was, a very economically vibrant place at this time. So a larger overseas commercial and imperial network than England. Very high rates of urbanization, very high rates of literacy, all kinds of things, very robust philosophical tradition, lots of universities, and great publishing industry, right? So all these factors that we think potentially would be important to economic thought, and the Dutch themselves are, what I found is a little upset about what happened in this era when it comes to economic thinking, because the black here are the number of texts, the English texts, and the white are the number of Dutch texts. And as you can see, there's a pretty significant difference in the number of textbooks. And there just isn't a large publication. There's not the same efflorescence of economic thought in the Netherlands at this time as there is in England. And a couple of other sort of significantly varying factors are the merchants in the Dutch Republic were much more powerful than they were in the English context. Amsterdam was essentially the most powerful of the different city-states in the Dutch. I can't remember the name. Does anyone remember the name now? Why do I can't? It's because it's obviously not a parliament. It's an entirely different structure. And I just can't. This is jet lag, unfortunately. But I'm sure it'll come to me. So in any case, Amsterdam is. I actually love the structure of the Dutch government at this time. I think it's so interesting. But Amsterdam is at the head of this, and Amsterdam's controlled by the merchant class, and they have veto power over all of the decisions. And in fact, it was so powerful, that they were engaged in these wars with the Spanish Empire, that Amsterdam would continue to sell supplies to the Spanish army as they were attacking the other townships, and they couldn't make them. So they were like, well, it's profit is profit. So the merchants here, they have access to the halls of power, so they don't have to take an alternative route, is the point. There's no reason, you don't have to give voice to this amount of discontent unless you're actually not able to make the decisions themselves. When the Dutch have an issue with a certain trade policy, they take that issue into the halls of government and don't have to take a circuitous route. So they also had less companies. There were companies and there were large companies in the Dutch Republic. However, there was only 4 of these large companies, and they were, importantly, they were never founded legally with the idea of private gain. They're always also supposed to be in pursuit of some kind of public benefit. So this changes the kind of calculus for the impact that they had in society. But for the most part, and this is related to the importance of the Dutch class, Dutch merchant class and government, they retained a kind of a guild and partnership model of commercial organization, which produces sort of less controversy in that setting as well. So there's less of an impetus, and when they do have controversial moments, they have direct access. So we don't see the same transformation. So ultimately here, I think what I hope I've shown is that we see this significant transformation that it occurs in the 17th century. This is not a wealth of nations story, something that important happens before then, something that has to do with institutional and structural transformations that are revealed, I believe, really you have to use both comparative historical methods and computational methods in order to see this story emerge. And it's important to use a kind of a structural lens. I see this as a large-scale cultural whole that was bridged by these authors, that also, by bridging this cultural whole between commercial state or commerce and state, they help and contribute to the development of a flourishing public sphere, and also transform the way that people thought about economic behavior from being something about, potentially the sins of individuals to the potential for development and growth at the level of the nation. So essentially they invented a new language of economic discourse to try to influence the government, mostly for self-interested reasons. I mean, I think it's almost entirely for self-interested reasons, but that doesn't mean that the effect is ultimately negative. It can be, but in this case, I would say, I think the effect was ultimately positive. And what we get over time, it is the incorporation more and more of a scientific logic of inquiry into the discourse. And often that's actually because the merchants were known to be, ambiguously typed individual, like they knew that the readers knew that they were often self-interested, their main arguments. So they need some other way of framing the arguments that gives it legitimacy. And what gave it legitimacy was appealing to this, new idea of scientific discourse. But that has a good consequence. Then by the end of the period, someone like John Locke thinks, well, this is an interesting question. How are prices formed? What is the underlying value of these goods? What is the underlying value of gold? And over time, this accumulates into more and more knowledge. So I suppose the last thing I would say is, in this case, the separation of these spheres of limited autonomy is a generator of new meaning and knowledge in a very positive way. And that we can't really see this relationship unless we also look into the micro level context of these large scale historical transformations and connect these two different levels. And that's it.